Welcome to Knife Chats. If you like this video, please take a moment to leave a comment. Thank you.
Seems like everywhere you go, you end up opening a knife and you find that on it. A piece of serration. Just everywhere you go, there's another one. Another serrated blade. Like, what's up with all these serrated blades? Why do we have so many knives with serrated blades? It's kind of an interesting story when you get right down to it. And would you believe it? For the most part, it has nothing to do with these kind of knives. It actually is something a little closer to home. A knife you usually found at the dinner table. When it comes to food, there's two kinds of knives you have out there. You have kitchen knives. These are knives that are used around the kitchen that tend to be sharp and they're used for preparing food. And then you have table knives. And table knives are knives used at the dinner table. So they're used when you're eating your food. For the most part these days, most of those are like butter knives and such, and they don't have an edge to them. There was that one table knife that did keep its edge, and that was the steak knife. Now this particular one is by Chicago Cutlery. And as you can tell, it has a fine or plain edge to it. It is not a serrated blade. About 4.5 inches long. And it's a carbon steel blade. Now if you know anything about carbon steel, you know it's a little harder to maintain than a stainless steel blade. You've got to keep it clean, otherwise it's going to rust. Even the table knives need it to be maintained, otherwise you get rust on it, and you really don't want to be cutting a steak with a rusty knife. Now early on, the maintenance of a steak knife was actually done by the domestic servants, because the families that could actually afford a set of steak knives had domestic servants to take care of them also. So other families that were actually cutting their steak were just using any knife that they happened to have. If they were eating steak, I mean, really most likely what they were eating was something more in the line of like sausages and such, and you didn't really need a steak knife for that. But then things started changing after World War I. You had a lot more people who could afford steak and were getting steak knives, but they really didn't know how to take care of them too well. And it was up to the the men of the house or the little lady to take care of those steak knives. And the godsend ended up being stainless steel, which started getting introduced around 1916 and actually started really hitting the market around 1926. Now that solved one of the problems. The blades weren't nearly as prone to rusting. However, you still needed to sharpen them in order to cut through that steak. And that was still a bit problematic. And so by around 1926 or so, you started having a lot more steak knives being made out of stainless steel, but they still had a fine edge on them. And then 1929 happened, and there was this stock market crash, and that was followed by a Great Depression. And the demand for steak knives kind of started dropping because the demand for steak started dropping also. And so there really wasn't much change in steak knives for a while. But the Great Depression was followed by World War II, and after World War II, a lot of people ended up having quite a bit of money, and things were a whole lot better off, and people started eating steak again, and steak knives started becoming popular again. And the problem, though, was those stainless steel steak knives, they just weren't cutting it. They really just didn't, literally cut it. But the knife industry came up with a solution. Serrations. Yeah, they would just put all these little bumps on there, so you don't have to slice through your steak. You can saw through your steak. And it really answered the question, because you didn't need to know how to sharpen a knife to have a decent set of steak knives. And the reason is the tips here will get dull before the inside portion gets dull, which means you end up having a sharp edge underneath that tip that is going to cut your steak, even though you are sawing through it. And so suddenly, you could not only have your steak, but you could cut it too. And serrated steak knives became the thing. Everyone would go out and buy a set of serrated steak knives. And what's even more important, a serrated steak knife is extremely less expensive to maintain than a non-serrated steak knife, which means the restaurant industry also started eating it up because not only are they cheaper to buy to begin with, they're cheaper to maintain over a long period. And so if your customer happens to walk out with your steak knife, you're not out that much money because it was just a cheap steak knife as opposed to a more expensive steak knife. And that's why serrated steak knives were born, and that's why they still are around today. And I think that's why you end up seeing serrated blades on so many other knives today too, because it's a way to have a sharper edge for a longer period of time without any really heavy maintenance. So that's why you have so many serrated blades out there. Blame it on the steak knife and people not knowing how to sharpen a fine edge.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Knife Chats, and if you did, please like and share it with your friends. Comments are always welcome. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you'll know when the next episode of Knife Chats is up online. Thanks again. Hope to see you soon.